Sometime in the early 90s, I was staying with some friends in Sheffield. While waiting for them to return, I started exploring their bookshelves and came across an old leather-bound confirmation present. This was a book of Psalms, Ronald Knox's translation of the Psalter. Although I didn't actually get on with the translation, as I sat waiting, the idea of a different kind of Book of Psalms began to take shape in my mind. Many years later, while I was still at school, I'd visited the convent of San Marco in Florence, where in each of the friars' cells there's a painting by Fra Angelico illustrating some episode from the Gospels. Sitting in those cells had been a formative part of my own spiritual journey and had shown me at the same time how paintings can speak to deep places in the soul. The experience in Florence had shaped my own ambition as a painter, but while painting had been at the centre of my life, I'd also had a long-standing interest in poetry. After I left art school and moved up to Oxford, I started writing some poetry and produced some illustrated books in which I tried to combine the two things. The same literary interest had led me to join Dr. Jeremy Hughes's class in Biblical Hebrew, which, it being Oxford, I discovered was taking place just down the road from my studio. As I sat looking through Ronald Knox's psalm book in Sheffield, all these various experiences began to come together. Because the psalms are so various and different from each other, speaking to every mood and shift in our spiritual weather, reading through the Psalter can feel like walking through a spacious building in which each poem, like the individual cells in San Marco, provides an opportunity for contemplation and reflection. Might it be possible to produce a book of Psalms that attempted something like this, where each fresh translation of each psalm appeared alongside an illustration which invited the reader to pause and contemplate some aspect of it? To read the poems that we call psalms is in fact to enter the life of an actual building, though one which was first destroyed some 2,500 years ago. The temple in Jerusalem, carved throughout with cherubim, palm trees and open flowers, with its interior from wall to wall overlaid with gold, was the backdrop, as numerous references within the Psalms make clear, against which these poems were originally performed. The Greek word psalmos refers to a musical instrument or to a song sung to this accompaniment. And it's clear, again from multiple references within them, that the Psalms were songs intended for performance by temple singers and musicians. The physical destruction of the temple, with axes and hatchets, they hack away all the engraved work, together with the abolition of its musical life and the dispersal of the musicians and choirs, left the Psalms orphaned from their parent culture. In doing so, however, it also made them a unique seed of human creativity. Perhaps no other collection of poems in the history of the world has drawn out such a range and depth of imaginative responses. In reading the Psalms, we in a sense recreate the life of the temple, so that with each new reading, the walls of the place once left desolate are stone by stone within the inner being of the reader, imaginatively rebuilt. But the creativity these poems inspired went beyond mere imagination. The orphan status of the Psalms is nowhere more clearly indicated than in their titles. It is these which remind us that the Psalms are songs for which we have the words but not the music. Lilies, alamoth, doves of far off terebinths, do not destroy. Hind of the dawn probably all refer to settings and tunes. Likewise, the so-called technical terms, Higgaion, Sheminith, Maskil, Selah, were presumably intended to give some kind of guide to performance. But it's not clear that even the Jewish Septuagint translators knew exactly what these archaic terms referred to. For the Psalms to be used, to be sung in the synagogue, to be sung by Jesus and his disciples, to be sung by the early church, new music and new settings were required. The first seed of creativity that the Psalms sowed, both in the Second Temple and later Judaism and in the early church, was consequently a musical one. And accompanying the seed of music was a seed of poetry. As the Psalms moved out from their original context into the Jewish diaspora and into the early church communities, they were translated along with the rest of the scriptures, first into Greek, then into Latin and Coptic, and eventually into innumerable other languages. Robert Frost famously defined poetry as that which is lost in translation. Frost may overstate the case, but while all translation is problematic, translating the heightened speech of poetry into another language does involve particular challenges. The characteristic of the Psalms that the 18th century Anglican bishop Robert Lowth first described as parallelism, saying something and then repeating it in different words, it is a poetic technique which, as C.S. Lewis pointed out, survives translation in a way that metre and rhyme can't. Other aspects of their poetry, though, are more evanescent. From the first line of the first psalm, Asherei ha'ish asher lo halach b'asath rashaim, we're presented with a mouthful of subtly rhyming vowels and consonants that inevitably evaporate in translation. So do the alphabetical acrostics, so do the particular cultural resonances of the psalmist's imagery. Any translator who is to do justice to their task is thus faced with finding a poetic idiom, an equivalent verbal music or heightened speech within the language of their own place and time. The translator must become a poet. The title of this collection of poems in the Hebrew Bible is Sefer Tehillim, the Book of Praises. And praise is the cantus firmus, the fixed song that sounds throughout the collection. The 5 books of 150 psalms have in consequence provided Jews and Christians over the centuries with something like a language of thanksgiving, a vocabulary of gratitude. If though praise is the fixed song of the collection, it's surrounded by a counterpoint of other voices. There are voices of complaint, lament and anger, expressions of pain, of guilt, of spiritual desolation and longing. They contradict, challenge and interrogate the larger theme. Indeed, sometimes seem on the point, though that point is never quite reached, of overwhelming the unshakable cantus firmus of the whole collection. Although the Psalms sometimes speak to and with the voice of the whole community, in very many of the Psalms, the tone is highly personal. consequently, the rapid alternation between the antiphonal voices of complaint, lamentation, or violent anger, and the cantus firmus of praise often seem to reflect the sudden changes of spiritual weather that occur within the life of the individual. All these dramatis persona need to be heard. The translator must become not only a poet, but a dramatist. Nevertheless, however poignant the personal situations out of which the psalms seem to spring, the performance notes and the existence of the collection itself makes clear that these individual voices have been folded into the worship of the community of Israel as it comes to the house of the Lord, where the golden cherubim symbolize the abiding presence of God. If the requirements of singing and reading make the psalm a seed of music and poetry, it was this need to imaginatively recreate some equivalent of the temple setting that made this psalm a seed of visual creativity. The first and most obvious form this took was in the architecture and decoration of places of worship. The wonderful painted synagogue and the humbler painted house church at Dura Europos, both built sometime before 256 AD, were early instalments of an ever-expanding project in which new outposts of the vanished temple began to be established, often from the 5th century onwards, adorned with angels standing within gold mosaics, in centres of population across the known world. The coming of a new invention, the codex or book, allowed this project to expand still further and allowed the Psalms to move outside places of public worship into the private spaces of personal devotion. In this space, music was left behind, but instead the text could become itself an object of patient meditation. The earliest example of a complete book of Psalms, or Psalter, was found in a poor Coptic cemetery in a shallow grave placed under a young girl's head. The Mudil Codex, a Coptic translation from the late 4th century, is undecorated text, but in time the script itself began to be used as a kind of musical setting, inviting the reader to pause, to linger, to enter into the meaning. In scholars' Bibles, where Jerome's 4 different translations appeared as parallel texts, this only involved the initial letter appearing in a different colour. But over the centuries, this developed into chrysography, writing in gold, where decorated initials or even occasionally whole texts might be written in gold. From the 7th and 8th century, the first of what was to become a long tradition of illustrated psalters began to appear. In church buildings, any kind of imagery is a background, while liturgy, like the singing of the psalms, is enacted in front of it. In an illustrated gospel or psalter, whatever the role of the image, it was still the text that needed to be in the foreground, and medieval psalm illustrators often confined their work to the margins. When I first began translating and illustrating the Psalms in the early 1990s, it was this relationship of text and image that was the first thing I had to think about. At the outset of the collection, Psalm 1 talks of the man whose delight is in the law of the Lord and who meditates, literally murmurs his law day and night. If the purpose of illustrating the Psalms was to provide a way of fixing the attention that aided this kind of murmuring or meditation in a private setting where music wasn't available, it had to involve both image and text. Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi, wrote about the different parts of the brain involved in languages that read from right and from the left. And this characteristic of English and Hebrew suggested a way in which the placing of both images and text could express the meaning of the poems.